Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight we explore the history of salt. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now, let's begin. Salt is everywhere. It is in the ocean that covers most of our planet, dissolved in concentrations of roughly 35 grams per litre of seawater. It is in our blood, maintaining the precise balance of fluids that keeps our cells functioning. It is in the earth beneath our feet, deposited in vast underground formations that stretch for miles, the remnants of ancient seas that evaporated millions of years ago. Salt is so common, so familiar, that we hardly think about it anymore. We shake it onto our food without consideration. We spread it on icy roads in winter. We use it in thousands of industrial processes. Yet for most of human history, salt was anything but ordinary. It was precious, it was powerful, and it shaped the course of civilizations in ways that still echo through our world today. The chemical name for common salt is sodium chloride, a compound made of sodium and chlorine atoms bonded together in a crystalline structure. Each grain of salt, no matter how small, contains billions upon billions of these molecules arranged in a perfect cubic lattice. When you look at salt crystals under magnification, you see tiny cubes stacked together, geometric and precise. This simple compound, just two elements joined together, has been essential to life on Earth since long before humans walked the planet. Salt regulates the movement of water in and out of cells. It enables nerve impulses to fire. It allows muscles to contract. Without salt, complex life as we know it could not exist. The story of salt begins not with humans, but with the formation of Earth itself, some 4.5 billion years ago. As our planet cooled from its molten beginning, water vapour condensed and fell as rain, filling the low places and creating the first oceans. These early seas were different from the oceans we know today, but they contained dissolved minerals washed down from the rocks and soil of the young Earth. Sodium and chlorine were among these minerals, and they accumulated in the water, unable to escape through evaporation. Over geological time, as rivers continued to carry minerals to the sea, and water evaporated and fell again as rain, the concentration of salt in the oceans gradually increased. The oceans became saltier, generation after generation, age after age. Life began in these salty seas. The first simple organisms, single cells without even a nucleus, emerged in an environment where salt was always present. As life evolved and became more complex, the internal chemistry of living things retained this connection to the sea. When the first creatures crawled out of the ocean and onto land, hundreds of millions of years ago, they brought the sea with them, in a sense. Their bodies maintained an internal environment similar to seawater, with salt solutions flowing through veins and tissues. Even now, even in creatures like us, who have been land-dwelling for countless generations, our cells still operate in a salty internal ocean, carefully regulated and maintained. For early humans, salt would have come primarily from eating meat. The blood and tissues of animals contained salt, and a diet rich in animal products would have provided enough sodium and chlorine for survival. But as human societies developed and people began to rely more heavily on agriculture and plant-based foods, the need for additional salt became pressing. Plants generally contain very little sodium, and a diet based mainly on grains, vegetables, and fruits could leave people deficient in this essential mineral. This deficiency manifests in various ways: weakness and fatigue at first, then more serious problems with nerve and muscle function. Ancient peoples would have noticed that they felt better, stronger, more energetic when they consumed salt. They would have observed animals seeking out salt licks, places where salt naturally occurs on the surface of the earth, and they would have recognized the value of this white crystalline substance. The earliest evidence of salt production by humans dates back thousands of years. In what is now Romania, archaeological sites show that people were boiling salt-rich spring water to extract salt as early as 6,000 years ago. In China, salt production from brine wells may go back even further. These early salt makers discovered that by heating salty water, they could evaporate the water and leave behind the salt. It was a simple process in principle, but it required fuel for fires, containers that could withstand heat and time. Salt production became one of humanity's first industries, one of the first ways that people systematically transformed natural resources into valuable products. As human societies grew more complex and populations increased, the demand for salt increased as well. Salt became essential not just for nutrition, but for preservation. Before refrigeration, before canning, before any modern method of food storage, salt was one of the few ways to keep food from spoiling. Meat and fish could be packed in salt or soaked in brine, and they would last for months or even years. Vegetables could be preserved in salt as well. This meant that food could be stored through winter, that it could be transported over long distances, that armies could be fed on campaign, and ships could be provisioned for long voyages. Salt made civilization possible in ways that are hard to overstate. It allowed people to live in cities far from the sources of their food. It enabled trade networks that spanned continents. It provided security against famine and want. The value of salt in the ancient world cannot be measured only in economic terms, though it certainly had economic value. Salt was woven into culture, into religion, into the fabric of daily life. It appeared in rituals and ceremonies. It was offered to gods. It sealed agreements and covenants. The word salary comes from the Latin word for salt, sal, though whether Roman soldiers were actually paid in salt, or whether the word simply reflects salt's value, is a matter of historical debate. What is clear is that salt mattered, profoundly and universally. Every human society that left records behind left evidence of salt's importance. From the salt routes of Africa to the salt mines of Europe, from the coastal salt pans of Asia to the salt springs of the Americas, the story of salt is inseparable from the story of human civilization. The ancient world organized itself around salt in ways both visible and invisible. Where salt could be found or produced, settlements grew. Where salt was scarce, people traded for it, sometimes traveling great distances or paying extraordinary prices. The geography of salt shaped the geography of human civilization, determining which routes would become trade roads, which settlements would grow into cities, which regions would prosper, and which would struggle. In ancient China, salt production became a sophisticated enterprise remarkably early. By the time of the Zhou dynasty, more than 3,000 years ago, Chinese salt makers had developed techniques for extracting salt from brine wells that were, in some ways, more advanced than methods used in Europe until relatively recent times. They drilled wells deep into the earth using bamboo pipes, reaching underground deposits of salty water. The brine was then drawn up and boiled in large iron pans to evaporate the water and crystallize the salt. Some of these wells in Sichuan province reached depths of hundreds of feet, an extraordinary engineering achievement for the time. The Chinese also discovered that natural gas often accompanied the brine in these wells, and they learned to capture this gas and use it as fuel for the evaporation process, a remarkably efficient system that anticipated by millennia the industrial use of natural gas. The organization of salt production in ancient China reveals much about the relationship between salt and political power. Salt was so valuable that it became a state monopoly in many periods of Chinese history. The government controlled production and distribution. taxing salt heavily and using the revenue to fund armies, build infrastructure, and maintain the apparatus of the state. This pattern, government control of salt production and heavy taxation, would repeat itself across cultures and centuries. Salt was too valuable to leave entirely in private hands, and the predictable demand for salt made it an ideal target for taxation. People needed salt to live, they could not simply choose to do without it, and so salt taxes were among the most reliable sources of government revenue in the pre-modern world. In the Mediterranean region, salt was harvested from the sea itself through solar evaporation. Along coastlines from Spain to Greece, people created shallow pools where seawater could be trapped and left to evaporate under the sun. As the water slowly disappeared into the air, the concentration of salt increased, until eventually salt crystals formed and could be raked up and collected. This method required the right climate, with warm temperatures, strong sun, and low rainfall. But where conditions were suitable, it produced salt with relatively little labour or fuel. The salt pans of the Mediterranean became important economic assets, carefully managed and often fought over. Cities built their wealth on salt. Venice, which would become one of the great powers of medieval Europe, began its rise to prominence in part through its control of salt production in the lagoons of the northern Adriatic. The Roman Empire at its height consumed vast quantities of salt. It was needed not just for preserving food, but for processing leather, for various crafts and industries, and for the daily life of millions of people spread across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The Romans built an extensive road network partly to facilitate the transport of salt and other essential goods. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, was one of the major routes leading into Rome, carrying salt from the coastal salt works to the inland capital. Roman engineers and administrators understood that controlling the supply of salt meant controlling an essential resource, and they managed salt production and distribution with characteristic efficiency and organisation. In Africa, salt took on particular importance because of the uneven distribution of natural salt deposits across the continent. The Sahara Desert, one of the harshest environments on Earth, became home to a thriving salt trade because of the deposits found in certain oases and desert regions. At Tayoudeni, in what is now Mali, salt has been mined from underground deposits for more than 1,000 years. Workers in these desert mines labour in extreme heat, cutting blocks of salt from the earth and preparing them for transport. These blocks of salt, each weighing perhaps 30 or 40 kilograms, would be loaded onto camels and carried in great caravans across the desert, travelling for weeks to reach the cities and markets of West Africa. The salt trade connected the Mediterranean coast with sub-Saharan Africa, moving salt southward and bringing gold, ivory, and other goods northward. This trans-Saharan trade made cities like Timbuktu wealthy and powerful, created kingdoms and empires, and facilitated cultural exchange across vast distances. The salt caravans of the Sahara operated according to rhythms dictated by climate and geography. Caravans travelled in the cooler months when the desert was more tolerable, and they followed routes marked by wells and oases where water could be found. The men who led these caravans and the merchants who organised the trade possessed specialised knowledge passed down through generations. They knew how to navigate by the stars, how to read the landscape for signs of water, how to manage camels and maintain discipline during the long desert crossings. The salt trade was dangerous and difficult, but it was also profitable enough to attract traders willing to accept the risks. In medieval Europe, salt production and trade became increasingly organised and regulated. The salt works of the Atlantic coast, particularly in the Bay of Bournemouth in France, produced enormous quantities of salt through solar evaporation. This salt was loaded onto ships and transported throughout northern Europe, where the climate made solar evaporation impractical. The Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant guilds and market towns that dominated trade in northern Europe, dealt heavily in salt. They transported salt from France and Portugal to the Baltic region, and they brought back timber, fur, grain, and other northern products. Salt was central to the Baltic herring industry, which became one of the economic engines of medieval northern Europe. Herring were caught in huge numbers, packed in salt, and distributed across the continent. Salted herring became a staple food, affordable enough for common people, yet produced and traded on an industrial scale. The preservation of fish, particularly cod and herring, depended absolutely on salt. Without adequate salt, fish would spoil within days, becoming inedible and worthless. With proper salting, fish could last for months or even years, remaining edible and nutritious. This transformation from perishable to durable good meant that fishing could become a major industry, that coastal communities could export their catch far inland, and that protein could reach populations that had limited access to fresh meat or fish. The salted fish trade connected Iceland to Italy, Norway to Spain, creating economic interdependencies and cultural connections that helped shape the development of European civilization. As societies became more complex and centralized, the control of salt became increasingly intertwined with the exercise of political power. Rulers understood that whoever controlled salt controlled something essential to daily life, and this control could be converted into revenue, influence, and authority. The taxation of salt became one of the most common and most resented forms of government revenue across the world. People needed salt. They could not refuse to buy it, and so salt taxes fell on everyone, rich and poor alike. This made salt taxes both effective and deeply unpopular, a combination that would eventually contribute to social upheaval and revolution. In France, the gabelle, as the salt tax was known, became one of the most hated aspects of the Ancien regime. The system was complex and varied from region to region, but in many areas the government not only taxed salt heavily, but also required each household to purchase a minimum quantity of salt each year, whether they needed it or not. The price of salt under this system could be many times what it cost to produce, with the difference going into royal coffers. Enforcement was strict, and smuggling salt, or even possessing salt that had not been properly taxed, could result in severe punishment, including imprisonment or forced labour in the galleys. The inequity of the gabelle, combined with exemptions granted to privileged groups like the nobility and clergy, created deep resentment among common people. This resentment contributed to the revolutionary atmosphere that would eventually culminate in the French Revolution of 1789. Among the grievances listed in the Cahiers de Doléances, the lists of complaints drawn up by communities across France in the early days of the Revolution, the salt tax appeared repeatedly. When the Revolution abolished the gabelle, it was celebrated as a liberation from an oppressive burden. The British Empire also relied heavily on salt taxes as a source of revenue, particularly in India. Under British rule, the production and sale of salt in India were made a government monopoly, and salt was heavily taxed. For the people of India, many of whom were poor, and for whom salt was an essential and basic necessity, these salt taxes represented a significant burden. The salt laws prohibited Indians from collecting or producing their own salt, even in coastal areas where salt could be easily obtained from seawater. This policy would eventually become a focal point for resistance to British rule. In 1930, Mohandas Gandhi, the leader of the Indian independence movement, organised the Salt March, a peaceful protest against the salt laws. Gandhi and his followers walked more than 200 miles to the Arabian Sea, where Gandhi symbolically picked up a handful of salt from the beach, breaking the law in a deliberate act of civil disobedience. the Salt March captured international attention, and the chemistry of salt, while simple in its basic composition, reveals interesting complexities when examined more closely. Sodium chloride is an ionic compound, meaning that it is held together not by shared electrons, as in covalent compounds, but by the electrical attraction between positively charged sodium ions and negatively charged chloride ions. When salt dissolves in water, these ions separate and move freely through the solution. This is why salt water conducts electricity while pure water does not. The separated ions can carry electrical current. This property of salt has implications not just for chemistry and physics, but for biology as well. The movement of sodium and chloride ions across cell membranes creates electrical potentials that drive many biological processes. Nerve impulses, the signals that travel along neurons, allowing us to think and sense and move, depend on the rapid movement of sodium ions through channels in the cell membrane. Without salt, without sodium and chloride, the nervo. The human need for salt is real and physiological. Our bodies lose salt through sweat, through urine, through various normal processes of metabolism and waste elimination. In hot climates, or during heavy physical exertion, when sweating is profuse, salt loss can be substantial. This lost salt must be replaced. People who are deprived of adequate salt experience a range of symptoms, from mild discomfort to serious medical problems. The body tries to conserve salt when intake is low, but there are limits to how efficiently this can be done. Prolonged salt deficiency can lead to hyponatremia, a condition where sodium levels in the blood become dangerously low. Symptoms include confusion, weakness, seizures, and in severe cases, death. For most of human history, when salt was expensive or scarce, ensuring adequate salt intake was a genuine concern, not merely a matter of preference or taste. Yet the amount of salt humans actually need is relatively modest. The minimum requirement for survival is only a few grams per day, far less than what most people in modern developed nations consume. This raises questions about why humans seem to crave salt, why we find salty foods appealing even when we are consuming more than enough salt to meet our physiological needs. The answer appears to lie in evolutionary history. For our ancestors, living in environments where salt was often scarce, a strong appetite for salt would have been adaptive. Those who sought out and consumed salt when it was available would have been more likely to maintain adequate sodium levels and therefore more likely to survive and reproduce. This preference for salt became encoded in our biology, part of the complex set of drives and appetites that govern eating behaviour. In the modern world, where salt is cheap and abundant, this evolutionary adaptation can lead to overconsumption, but the drive itself makes sense in the context of the production methods for salt varied enormously depending on local conditions and available resources. In regions with significant rainfall or without access to seawater, salt had to be obtained from underground deposits. Rock salt, the solid mineral form of sodium chloride, occurs in thick layers deep within the earth, the remains of ancient seas that evaporated millions of years ago. These salt deposits can be mined much like coal or metal ores. Miners would dig shafts down to the salt layer, then excavate chambers and tunnels, cutting away the salt and bringing it to the surface. Salt mines could be enormous, extending for miles underground. The Wielicka salt mine in Poland, which has been in operation since the 13th century, contains nearly 200 miles of tunnels and passages, carved out over centuries of continuous mining. The mine reaches depths of over 1,000 feet. Working in salt mines was difficult and often dangerous. Tunnels could collapse. Flooding was a constant risk, and the work itself was physically demanding. Yet salt mining employed thousands of people across Europe and provided a steady supply of this essential commodity. Another method of obtaining salt from underground sources involved drilling wells to reach brine, water saturated with dissolved salt. This brine could then be pumped to the surface and evaporated to recover the salt. In some locations, natural brine springs brought salt water to the surface without the need for drilling. These springs became centres of salt production, and settlements grew up around them. The city of Salzburg in Austria takes its name from salt, Salz in German, reflecting its origins as a centre of salt production and trade. Throughout Central Europe, place names incorporating sal or hall or similar elements often indicate locations where salt was once produced or traded. These linguistic traces remind us of how deeply salt was embedded in the geography and economy of the pre-modern world. The age of exploration that began in the 15th century transformed the salt trade in profound ways. European ships began venturing farther from home, seeking new trade routes and new sources of wealth. Salt played a crucial role in these voyages, not as cargo sought for profit, though that was sometimes the case, but as an essential supply needed to preserve food for long ocean journeys. Ships sailing to the Americas, to Africa, to Asia needed provisions that would last for months at sea. Salted meat and fish made these voyages possible. Without adequate supplies of preserved food, crews would face starvation, and expeditions would fail. The ability to preserve food with salt was thus fundamental to the expansion of European influence around the globe. The cod fisheries of the North Atlantic became intimately connected with salt and with the European colonization of the Americas. Cod were abundant in the cold waters off Newfoundland and the northern coastlines of North America. European fishermen, particularly from Portugal, Spain, France and England, began making seasonal voyages to these fishing grounds as early as the late 15th century, possibly even before Columbus reached the Caribbean. The cod they caught were processed and preserved with salt, either on board the ships or at temporary shore stations. These salted cod, dried and hardened, could then be transported back to Europe where they commanded good prices. The fishing industry created a demand for salt, and it created economic incentives for establishing permanent settlements in North America. The early history of European colonization in what would become Canada and the northeastern United States is inseparable from the story of cod and salt. Different methods of salting fish produce different products with different qualities. Dry salting involved covering fish heavily with salt and allowing moisture to be drawn out, resulting in a hard, dried product that could last for years. Wet salting kept the fish in barrels of brine, producing a different texture and flavour. The choice of method depended on various factors, including the intended market, the available salt supply, and local tradition. Portuguese salted cod, known as bacalhau, became a staple of Portuguese cuisine and remains so today. The fish were caught thousands of miles away, preserved with salt mined or evaporated in Portugal or imported from elsewhere, and then distributed throughout the Portuguese-speaking world. This global network of production, preservation, and distribution, all made possible by salt, was an early example of the kind of international trade that would come to define the modern economy. In the Caribbean and along the coasts of South America, salt production took on new importance as European colonial powers established sugar plantations. Sugar production required enormous amounts of labour, and that labour was provided by enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic in one of the great crimes of human history. The people enslaved on these plantations needed to be fed, and salted fish became a major part of their diet. Cod from the North Atlantic fisheries was shipped to the Caribbean specifically to feed enslaved workers. This created a triangular trade pattern, with manufactured goods going from Europe to Africa, enslaved people being transported from Africa to the Americas, and products of plantation agriculture, along with demand for salted fish, flowing back to Europe and to the fishing stations of North America. Salt was woven into this system at multiple points. It preserved the fish that fed the enslaved. It was used in various stages of sugar processing, and it represented another co. The Caribbean region also became a producer of salt through solar evaporation. Islands and coastal areas with the right conditions saw the development of salt pans where seawater could be trapped and evaporated. The salt produced in the Caribbean was used locally and also exported. It entered into the complex web of trade that connected the Atlantic world. Dutch merchants were particularly active in the Caribbean salt trade, controlling salt production on islands like Bonaire and transporting salt to markets in North America and Europe. The Dutch, with their long experience in managing water and their sophisticated commercial networks, were well positioned to profit from salt. Their control of salt production was part of a broader strategy of commercial dominance that made the Dutch Republic one of the wealthiest societies in 17th century Europe. The technology of salt production evolved slowly over centuries, with incremental improvements rather than sudden breakthroughs. The basic principles remained the same: evaporation to concentrate brine and crystallize salt, but the efficiency and scale of operations increased. In China, the development of deeper drilling techniques and better pumping methods allowed access to richer brine sources. In Europe, improvements in pan design and fuel efficiency made evaporation more economical. The construction of specialized buildings and infrastructure around salt works, including warehouses, drying sheds, and transportation facilities, reflected the growing scale and organization of the industry. By the 18th century, salt production in many regions had become a substantial enterprise, employing hundreds or thousands of workers and producing thousands of tons of salt annually. The human palate's relationship with salt goes beyond mere biological need. Salt enhances flavor, making food more appealing and more satisfying. It does this through several mechanisms. Salt suppresses bitter flavors while enhancing sweet and savory ones. It increases salivation, which helps release aromatic compounds from food. It affects the texture of food, particularly in baking and in meat preparation. The use of salt as a seasoning, as opposed to merely a preservative or a source of essential sodium, developed over time as salt became more available and as culinary traditions grew more sophisticated. Different cultures developed different approaches to using salt in cooking, but virtually all human cuisines make use of salt in some form. The exceptions are rare and generally found only in isolated communities with no access to salt sources. The preservation of vegetables through salting created foods that became important in many traditional diets. Sauerkraut, pickles, kimchi, and many other fermented or pickled vegetables rely on salt not just to preserve, but also to control the fermentation process. Salt inhibits the growth of harmful bacteria while allowing beneficial lactic acid bacteria to thrive. These beneficial bacteria convert sugars in the vegetables to lactic acid, which further preserves the food and gives it characteristic sour flavors. The tradition of preserving vegetables with salt developed independently in many cultures, suggesting that people discovered through experience that salting vegetables not only made them last longer, but also made them nutritious and palatable. In northern climates with long winters, preserved vegetables were essential sources of nutrition when fresh produce was unavailable. The Industrial Revolution that began in the late 18th century transformed nearly every aspect of human life, and salt was no exception. The development of new technologies and new sources of power changed how salt was produced, how it was transported, and how it was used. The scale of salt production increased dramatically, and salt that had once been expensive and precious became cheap and abundant. This transformation happened gradually over the course of the 19th century, but its effects were profound and lasting. One of the key developments was the application of steam power to salt production. Steam engines could pump brine from deep wells more efficiently than animal or human power, allowing access to richer deposits. Steam power could also drive machinery for processing and packaging salt, reducing the labour required and increasing output. In the salt-producing regions of England, particularly in Cheshire where underground brine deposits were extensive, steam-powered pumping transformed the industry. Production increased enormously, and costs fell. Salt that had been a valuable commodity became an everyday item, affordable even to the poorest households. This abundance of cheap salt had implications for public health, for industry, and for patterns of food consumption. The discovery and exploitation of massive underground salt deposits in various parts of the world further increased supply. In North America, salt deposits in places like New York, Michigan, and Kansas proved to be extraordinarily rich. These deposits could be mined as rock salt or accessed through brine wells. The development of railroads in the 19th century made it economically feasible to transport salt from these inland sources to population centres and ports. Where once salt had to be produced near coastlines or at specific locations with brine springs, now it could be mined in the interior and shipped anywhere. The geography of salt production shifted, and regions that had never been significant producers entered the market. Chemical industries began using salt as a raw material in the 19th century, and this industrial demand would eventually dwarf all other uses of salt. The Leblanc process, developed in France in the late 18th century, used salt to produce soda ash, which was essential for making glass, soap, paper, and textiles. The process was inefficient and produced harmful waste products, but it worked, and it created a massive new market for salt. Later, the Solvay process, developed in the 1860s, provided a cleaner and more efficient way to produce soda ash from salt. These chemical processes consumed enormous quantities of salt. A factory using the Solvay process might use hundreds of tons of salt per day. The demand from chemical industries meant that salt production had to operate on a scale that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. The chemical relationship between salt and other substances became better understood during this period as chemistry emerged as a rigorous science. Humphrey Davy, the English chemist, succeeded in isolating sodium as a pure element in 1807 through the process of electrolysis. He passed an electric current through molten sodium hydroxide and obtained metallic sodium, a soft silvery metal that reacts violently with water. This was a remarkable achievement, demonstrating that salt, which seemed like a simple and elementary substance, was actually a compound that could be broken down into its constituent elements. Davy's work helped establish the foundations of electrochemistry and contributed to the broader understanding of how elements combine to form compounds. Sodium metal itself proved to have limited practical applications because of its extreme reactivity, but the chemistry of sodium compounds became increasingly important to industry. Sodium hydroxide, also known as caustic soda or lye, was used in soap making, in paper production, in petroleum refining, and in countless other industrial processes. It could be produced from salt through electrolysis of brine. Chlorine, the other component of salt, also found extensive industrial uses. It was used to bleach paper and textiles, to purify water, and later in the production of plastics and other synthetic materials. The industrial demand for chlorine and for sodium compounds drove an enormous expansion in salt production during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The development of refrigeration technology in the late 19th century began to change the way food was preserved and distributed. Mechanical refrigeration, first using ice made in factories and later through refrigeration systems on ships and in warehouses, made it possible to keep food fresh without salting. Meat and fish could be transported long distances while staying cold, arriving at their destinations still fresh rather than preserved. This might have been expected to reduce demand for salt, and indeed the use of salt for preservation did decline relative to its peak in the pre-refrigeration era. However, the overall demand for salt continued to grow because industrial uses expanded so rapidly. By the early 20th century, only a small fraction of salt production was going to food preservation. The vast majority was being consumed by chemical industries, by manufacturers, and by various other industrial processes. Salt also found important applications in agriculture, though these developed somewhat later than industrial uses. Salt could be used to control certain agricultural pests and weeds, though this required careful application to avoid damaging crops or soil. More significantly, salt became important in livestock management. Animals, like humans, need sodium and chlorine in their diets, and salt supplementation for livestock became standard practice. Salt blocks or loose salt would be provided to cattle, sheep, and other animals, allowing them to consume salt as needed. This improved animal health and productivity. In regions where natural salt sources were not readily available to grazing animals, providing supplemental salt made a real difference in the success of livestock operations. The connection between salt and human settlement patterns, so important throughout history, began to weaken during the industrial age. No longer did cities and trade routes need to organize themselves around salt sources. Salt could be produced in bulk at favorable locations and then distributed anywhere there was demand. The railroad networks and later the highway systems made transportation cheap and reliable. A factory in the interior of a continent could receive salt as easily as a coastal city could. This liberation from the geographic constraints of salt production was part of a broader pattern in the industrial economy, where transportation and technology increasingly overcame the limitations imposed by natural resource distribution. Yet the legacy of salt's importance remained visible in place names, in old trade routes that had become major roads, in cities that had grown wealthy from the salt trade and maintained their prominence even as the source of that wealth shifted to other industries. The 20th century brought salt into new realms of application that earlier generations could never have imagined. While food preservation and chemical industries continued to consume enormous quantities, new uses emerged that reflected the changing nature of society and technology. Salt became essential to modern life in ways that went far beyond its traditional roles, embedding itself in infrastructure, in manufacturing processes, and in the functioning of complex technological systems. One of the most visible modern uses of salt is in winter road maintenance. In regions where snow and ice are common during winter months, salt is spread on roads and highways to improve safety. When salt is applied to ice, it lowers the freezing point of water, causing the ice to melt even when the air temperature is below the normal freezing point. This happens because salt disrupts the formation of ice crystals. Water molecules normally arrange themselves into a rigid crystalline structure when they freeze, but the presence of dissolved salt ions interferes with this arrangement. The result is that a salt solution will remain liquid at temperatures where pure water would freeze solid. This property makes salt invaluable for keeping roads passable during winter weather. The practice of salting roads became widespread in the 1930s and 1940s, first in North America and then in Europe and other regions with suitable climates. Before this, winter roads were often treacherous, and communities in snowy regions could become isolated for extended periods. The ability to keep roads clear transformed winter life, allowing commerce to continue, enabling people to travel for work and personal reasons, and improving emergency response capabilities. However, the use of road salt also created environmental concerns that would become increasingly apparent over time. The salt that melts ice on roadways does not simply disappear. It runs off into soil and waterways, where it can accumulate and cause harm to plants, aquatic life, and even infrastructure. The environmental impact of road salt is complex and multifaceted. Salt increases the salinity of freshwater streams, ponds, and groundwater. Many freshwater organisms are sensitive to salt and cannot survive in elevated concentrations. Fish, amphibians, and aquatic insects can all be harmed by salt pollution. Plants along roadsides can suffer damage from salt spray and from salt-contaminated soil. The roots of trees absorb salty water, which interferes with their ability to take up other necessary nutrients. Over time, repeated exposure to road salt can kill vegetation. Additionally, salt accelerates the corrosion of metal, affecting vehicles, bridges, and other infrastructure. The steel reinforcing bars inside concrete can corrode when exposed to salt, weakening structures and requiring expensive repairs. Despite these problems, the safety benefits of road salt have generally been judged to outweigh the costs, and efforts have focused on using salt more efficiently and developing alternative de-icing methods. The food industry in the modern era uses salt not just for preservation, but also for texture modification and flavour enhancement in processed foods. Salt affects the properties of proteins in meat, making them bind together and hold moisture. This is essential in the production of sausages, processed meats, and many other products. Salt controls the growth of microorganisms in cheese production, allowing beneficial cultures to develop while inhibiting spoilage organisms. In baking, salt strengthens gluten structure and controls yeast activity. The food processing industry depends on salt for functional properties that go beyond simple seasoning. A modern processed food product might contain salt for multiple reasons: to preserve it, to improve texture, to enhance flavour, and to control various chemical and biochemical processes during manufacturing and storage. The debate over salt and health emerged as a significant public health issue in the latter half of the 20th century. Medical research began to establish connections between high sodium intake and elevated blood pressure, a condition known as hypertension. High blood pressure is a risk factor for heart disease and stroke, which are leading causes of death in developed nations. Studies showed that populations with high average salt intake tended to have higher rates of hypertension than populations with lower intake. This led to public health recommendations to reduce sodium consumption. Health organizations began advocating for lower salt intake, typically recommending limits of around 2 grams of sodium per day, which translates to about 5 grams of salt. However, the relationship between salt intake and health proved to be more complicated than early studies suggested. Not everyone responds to salt in the same way. Some individuals are salt sensitive, meaning their blood pressure rises significantly when they consume more salt, while others appear to be salt resistant. The mechanisms underlying this variation are not fully understood, but appear to involve genetic factors, kidney function, and other aspects of physiology. Furthermore, some research suggested that very low salt intake might also have health risks, creating a debate about what level of consumption is optimal. The scientific consensus has continued to evolve, with ongoing research attempting to clarify the relationship between salt, blood pressure, and overall health outcomes. For food manufacturers, the push to reduce salt content created technical challenges. Salt does more than add flavour. It performs various functional roles in food products. Reducing salt content while maintaining acceptable taste, texture, and shelf life required reformulation and sometimes new processing techniques. Some companies gradually reduce salt content over time, allowing consumers to adjust to less salty flavours. Others developed salt substitutes or flavour enhancers that could partially replace salt. Potassium chloride can substitute for sodium chloride to some extent, though it has a slightly bitter taste that limits how much can be used. The goal of creating processed foods that are both healthy and appealing to consumers has driven considerable research and innovation in food science. In industrial applications, salt continues to play crucial roles in the 21st century. The chlor-alkali industry, which produces chlorine and sodium hydroxide from salt through electrolysis, remains one of the largest consumers of salt globally. The products of this industry feed into countless other manufacturing processes. Chlorine is used in producing polyvinyl chloride, commonly known as PVC, one of the most widely used plastics. It is used in water treatment to kill harmful bacteria and viruses, making municipal water supplies safe to drink. Sodium hydroxide is used in aluminum production, in petroleum refining, in making synthetic textiles, and in numerous other applications. The modern industrial economy depends on these salt-derived chemicals in ways that are often invisible to consumers, but nonetheless essential. Salt mining in the modern era has become highly mechanized and efficient. Large mining machines cut through salt deposits, loading the salt onto conveyor systems that transport it to the surface. Some salt mines operate as solution mines, where water is injected into salt deposits to dissolve the salt, and the resulting brine is pumped back to the surface. This method is efficient and avoids the need for underground excavation. The brine can then be evaporated to recover the salt, or it can be used directly in chemical processes. Modern salt production is a large-scale industrial operation, far removed from the manual labour and simple techniques that characterise salt making through most of history. The story of salt is also a story of geology, of processes that unfold over millions of years and shape the very structure of our planet. Understanding where salt comes from requires looking back into deep time, to periods when the Earth's geography was completely different from what we know today. The salt deposits that humans mine and use today were formed through cycles of flooding and evaporation that occurred long before our species existed, in some cases hundreds of millions of years ago. When a body of water becomes isolated from the ocean and begins to evaporate, the concentration of dissolved minerals increases. If evaporation continues long enough, these minerals will begin to precipitate out of the water and settle to the bottom. Different minerals precipitate at different concentrations. Calcium carbonate forms first, when the water has been reduced to about half its original volume. Gypsum begins to form when the volume is reduced to about 1/5. Salt begins to crystallize when the water volume has decreased to about 1/10 of the original. Other minerals, including potassium salts and magnesium salts, precipitate only when the water is almost completely gone. This sequence creates layered deposits, with different minerals at different levels. The great salt deposits of the world were formed when large areas of shallow sea were cut off from the ocean and gradually evaporated. This could happen through tectonic activity that raised land barriers, or through drops in sea level, or through a combination of factors. The Mediterranean basin, for example, was cut off from the Atlantic Ocean about 6 million years ago when the land bridge at Gibraltar rose. Over the following millennia, the Mediterranean largely dried up, becoming a series of extremely salty lakes and vast salt flats. This period, known as the Messinian salinity crisis, left enormous salt deposits on the floor of the Mediterranean. Eventually, geological changes reopened the connection at Gibraltar, and the Atlantic Ocean poured back in, refilling the Mediterranean basin. But the salt remained, buried under layers of sediment that accumulated over the following millions of years. Similar events occurred in other parts of the world at various times in Earth's history. The salt deposits under the North Sea, which are now mined by several European countries, were formed during the Permian period, roughly 250 million years ago. At that time, the region was covered by a large inland sea that repeatedly flooded and evaporated as climate conditions and sea levels changed. Each cycle of evaporation added another layer of salt. Over millions of years, these layers built up into deposits that are now thousands of feet thick in places. The same pattern occurred in North America, where extensive salt deposits in Michigan, Kansas, and other states record ancient seas that have long since vanished. The movement of tectonic plates and the deformation of the Earth's crust can push salt deposits deep underground or bring them closer to the surface. Salt behaves differently than most rocks under pressure. While most rocks are rigid and brittle, salt under sufficient pressure and temperature can flow like a very thick liquid. This property leads to the formation of salt domes, structures where salt has pushed upward through overlying rock layers. Salt domes can rise from depths of several miles, forming columns or mushroom shapes that can be thousands of feet tall. These domes are important not just as sources of salt, but also because they can trap oil and natural gas, creating reservoirs that are valuable to the petroleum industry. The presence of salt deep underground affects groundwater and surface water in many regions. When groundwater flows through salt deposits, it dissolves some of the salt and becomes brine. This brine can emerge at the surface as salt springs, which were important sources of salt for pre-industrial societies. The concentration of brine in these springs varies depending on how much salt the water encountered and how much mixing with fresh water occurred. Some springs produce nearly saturated brine, while others are only slightly salty. The exploitation of these springs required techniques to concentrate the brine and extract the salt, usually through boiling and evaporation. The ocean itself is the ultimate source of salt for the planet's water cycle. Rivers carry dissolved minerals from the land to the sea, and while most of this water eventually evaporates and returns as rain, the minerals remain behind. Over geological time, this process has made the ocean salty, but the salinity of the ocean is not uniform. It varies from place to place depending on factors like evaporation rates, rainfall, river input, and ocean currents. The Atlantic Ocean is generally saltier than the Pacific, for example, because evaporation rates are higher and there is less river input relative to the ocean's size. The Mediterranean and Red Seas are particularly salty because they are in hot, dry regions where evaporation greatly exceeds rainfall and river input. Certain bodies of water have become far saltier than the ocean because they are landlocked and subject to high evaporation. The Dead Sea, bordered by Jordan and Israel, has a salt concentration about 10 times that of the ocean. The water is so dense with dissolved minerals that humans float easily on the surface. Nothing can live in such extreme salinity except specially adapted microorganisms. The Great Salt Lake in Utah is similarly hypersaline, varying in concentration depending on recent precipitation and inflow from rivers. These extremely salty lakes are remnants of larger bodies of water that have shrunk over time, becoming more concentrated as they evaporated. They represent the same process that created ancient salt deposits, but caught at an intermediate stage rather than having gone to completion. The extraction of salt from the ocean through solar evaporation continues to be practiced in many coastal regions around the world. The process is essentially the same as it was thousands of years ago, though the scale and efficiency have improved. Seawater is channeled into shallow ponds where the sun and wind cause evaporation. As the water becomes more concentrated, it is moved through a series of ponds, each more concentrated than the last. Finally, when the concentration is high enough, the salt crystallizes and is harvested. The process takes time, usually several weeks or months depending on climate conditions, but it requires relatively little energy input beyond the construction and maintenance of the evaporation ponds. In regions with appropriate climate and geography, solar evaporation remains one of the most economical ways to produce salt. The quality and characteristics of salt can vary significantly depending on its source and how it is processed. Sea salt harvested through solar evaporation often contains trace amounts of other minerals, giving it a slightly different flavour and sometimes a different colour compared to pure sodium chloride. These trace minerals, including magnesium, calcium, and potassium, can affect taste and even provide small amounts of nutritional value. Rock salt mined from underground deposits is often very pure, having been filtered through geological processes over millions of years. However, it may also contain small amounts of impurities depending on the specific deposit and the surrounding geology. Refined salt, which has been purified through washing and recrystallization, is the purest form commonly available, being more than 99% sodium chloride. The cultural significance of salt extends far beyond its practical applications. Across human societies and throughout history, salt has carried symbolic weight and appeared in religious rituals, folk traditions, and everyday customs. This cultural dimension reflects the deep importance of salt in human life and the ways that practical necessity becomes woven into the fabric of belief and tradition. Even as salt has become cheap and abundant in the modern world, these cultural associations persist, echoes of a time when salt was rare and precious. In many religious traditions, salt appears as a symbol of purity, preservation, and incorruptibility. In Jewish tradition, salt is used in various ritual contexts. The sacrifices described in the Hebrew Bible were to be accompanied by salt, and even today, some Jewish customs involve placing salt on bread during the Sabbath meal. This practice connects to the idea of covenant, of permanent agreements that cannot be broken, just as salt preserves and prevents decay. The phrase covenant of salt appears in biblical texts to describe enduring promises. Christianity inherited some of these associations. In the Christian New Testament, Jesus tells his followers they are the salt of the earth, a metaphor suggesting they should preserve goodness and bring flavour to the world. Salt has been used in Christian baptismal rites in some traditions, symbolising purification and protection from corruption. Islamic tradition also recognises salt's importance. In some Muslim cultures, there is a saying that sharing salt creates a bond between people. To eat salt in someone's home is to enter into a relationship of hospitality and mutual obligation. This reflects a broader pattern found in many societies where salt serves as a symbol of hospitality and friendship. The sharing of food, particularly food preserved or flavoured with valuable salt, creates social bonds and carries obligations. To betray someone with whom you have shared salt is seen as especially treacherous. The expression "not worth his salt" in English, meaning someone is not valuable or does not earn their keep, derives from this association between salt and worth. Superstitions involving salt appear in many cultures. The belief that spilling salt brings bad luck, and that throwing a pinch of spilled salt over one's left shoulder will ward off this bad luck, is widespread in Europe and has been carried to other parts of the world through European emigration. The origins of this superstition are unclear, but it may relate to salt's historical value, so that spilling it represented a genuine economic loss that came to be associated with broader misfortune. Other salt-related superstitions exist in various cultures, often involving the use of salt to ward off evil spirits or negative influences. Salt might be scattered across doorways to prevent harmful entities from entering, or placed in the corners of rooms for protection. These practices reflect salt's association with purity and its ability to preserve and prevent corruption. In folklore and traditional medicine, salt was sometimes credited with healing or protective properties beyond its actual nutritional and preservative functions. Salt water was used to clean wounds, and while this practice does have some genuine medical benefit because salt can help prevent infection, it was often accompanied by beliefs about salt's special powers. Salt might be carried as a talisman or used in rituals intended to bring good fortune or drive away illness. These practices blur the line between practical application and magical thinking, reflecting a worldview where the natural and supernatural were not sharply distinguished. If salt could preserve food and was essential for life, perhaps it could also preserve health and ward off death in a more general sense. The language we use contains many expressions and idioms that reference salt, reflecting its historical importance. To be worth one's salt is to be competent and valuable. To take something with a grain of salt is to maintain skepticism, possibly derived from an ancient belief that a small amount of salt could neutralize poison. A salt of the earth person is reliable and good-hearted. Salary comes from Latin salarium, which may have referred to payments made to Roman soldiers, though the exact connection to salt is debated by historians. Regardless of the precise etymology, the linguistic connection between salt and compensation for work reflects salt's value and importance. These expressions persist in modern language, even though most people today have no direct experience of salt's scarcity or salt's historical role in economy and trade. Different cultures develop distinct culinary traditions around salt and foods preserved with salt. In Korea, kimchi, a fermented vegetable dish usually made with cabbage, has been a dietary staple for centuries. The fermentation process relies on salt to create conditions favourable to beneficial bacteria while inhibiting spoilage. Kimchi provides not just preserved vegetables, but also probiotics and vitamins that were particularly valuable during winter months. In Japan, tsukemono, pickled vegetables prepared with salt, serve a similar function and appear in various forms throughout Japanese cuisine. Scandinavian traditions of salt-curing fish, particularly herring and salmon, developed in response to the need to preserve abundant summer catches for winter consumption. Each of these traditions reflects local conditions, available resources, and historical patterns of salt access, yet all demonstrate the universal human need to preserve food and the central role of salt in meeting that need. The craft of salt making itself developed regional variations and specialized knowledge passed down through generations. Salt makers in different regions developed techniques adapted to local conditions. In tropical coastal areas, solar evaporation could be efficient and productive. In colder climates or inland areas, other methods were necessary. The knowledge of how to locate salt springs, how to construct evaporation pans, how to manage fires for boiling brine, how to judge when salt was ready to be harvested, all of this constituted a body of practical expertise. In some societies, salt makers formed guilds or associations, protecting their knowledge and their economic interests. The secrets of producing high-quality salt, or of producing salt efficiently, could be valuable and closely guarded. Trade in salt created connections between distant regions and different peoples. Salt routes crossed deserts, mountains, rivers, and seas. The people who worked these routes, whether as miners, transporters, merchants, or sailors, formed communities and networks that facilitated not just the movement of salt, but also the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The salt trade was one thread in the larger fabric of human interaction and exchange that has shaped our world. Archaeological evidence of salt trade appears in many ancient sites, where salt or materials used in salt production are found far from their places of origin. These findings help reconstruct ancient trade networks and patterns of economic interaction. In some places, evidence of historical salt production remains visible in the landscape. Old salt pans might still be seen along coastlines, even if they are no longer in use. Salt roads, paths that were once major trade routes, might persist as modern highways or appear as faint traces in remote areas. Abandoned salt mines become historical sites, some open to tourists who can walk through the chambers carved out over centuries of mining. These physical remnants connect us to the past, reminding us that the landscape we inhabit has been shaped by human activity over millennia, and that much of that activity was organised around basic needs like the need for salt. The modern salt industry operates on a scale that would be incomprehensible to people from earlier centuries. Global salt production now exceeds 280 million tonnes annually, a figure so large that it is difficult to grasp. This enormous output serves countless purposes, from the familiar to the obscure. While food-related uses still account for a significant portion, the majority of salt now goes to industrial applications that the average person never sees or thinks about. The production of chlorine and sodium hydroxide through the chlor-alkali process remains the single largest consumer of salt in the industrial world. These two chemicals are fundamental building blocks for modern manufacturing. Chlorine enters into the production of plastics, particularly polyvinyl chloride, which is used in pipes, siding, window frames, and countless other applications. It purifies drinking water in cities and towns around the world, making municipal water systems safe and preventing waterborne diseases that once killed millions. Sodium hydroxide is essential in the manufacture of paper, in the refining of petroleum, in the production of soaps and detergents, and in aluminum smelting. These uses may seem remote from our daily experience, yet they undergird the physical infrastructure of modern life. The chemical industry's demand for salt has driven the development of highly efficient production and distribution systems. Salt is mined from underground deposits using sophisticated machinery, or produced through solution mining, where water dissolves underground salt and the resulting brine is pumped to the surface. The scale of these operations is immense. A single salt mine might produce millions of tons per year. Transportation of salt occurs via rail, ship and truck, with logistics carefully managed to ensure steady supply to industrial customers. The economics of salt production favour large-scale operations with high capital investment, and the industry has become increasingly consolidated over time. In recent decades, attention has turned to the environmental implications of salt production and use. The mining of salt, like any form of mining, disturbs the landscape and can affect local ecosystems. Solution mining can cause surface subsidence if underground cavities collapse. The discharge of brine from salt production facilities into waterways must be carefully managed to avoid harming aquatic life. The most significant environmental concern, however, relates to the use of road salt for de-icing. As mentioned earlier, the salt applied to roads runs off into soil and water, accumulating over time and affecting ecosystems. Some regions have seen notable increases in the salinity of streams and lakes near heavily salted roads. Efforts to address the environmental impact of road salt have taken several forms. One approach involves using salt more efficiently, applying it only where and when needed rather than spreading it broadly. Technology now allows for precise application rates and targeted treatment of road surfaces. Pre-wetting salt with brine before application can make it more effective, allowing for reduced quantities. Alternative de-icing chemicals, such as calcium chloride and magnesium chloride, work at lower temperatures than sodium chloride and can be effective in smaller quantities, though they have their own environmental impacts and are generally more expensive. Some communities have experimented with using sand or other materials for traction instead of chemical de-icers, though this creates different environmental problems, including sediment accumulation in waterways. The debate over optimal salt intake in human diets continues to evolve as research provides new information. While public health authorities generally recommend limiting sodium intake, some researchers have questioned whether the evidence supports such strict limits for everyone. Population studies have shown that people in some regions consume very little salt and have low rates of hypertension, while people in other regions consume large amounts and have higher rates. However, these populations also differ in many other ways, including genetics, overall diet, physical activity levels, and other factors that affect cardiovascular health. Separating the specific effect of salt from these other variables is methodologically challenging. Recent research has focused on understanding individual variation in salt sensitivity. Some people's blood pressure responds strongly to changes in salt intake, while others show little response. Genetic factors appear to play a role, as do kidney function and various hormonal systems that regulate blood pressure and fluid balance. There is growing recognition that dietary recommendations might need to be more personalized rather than applying universal guidelines to everyone. However, public health policy necessarily deals with populations rather than individuals, and the current consensus remains that most people in developed nations consume more sodium than necessary and would benefit from modest reductions. The food industry has made significant efforts to reduce sodium content in processed foods in response to public health concerns. This has required reformulation of products, often involving years of research to maintain acceptable taste and texture with less salt. Some companies have successfully reduced sodium content by 10 to 20% over time through gradual changes that allow consumers to adapt. Others have developed products specifically marketed as reduced sodium or low sodium alternatives to traditional formulations. However, significant challenges remain because salt serves multiple functions in food beyond simply adding saltiness. It affects flavor perception in complex ways, influences texture and moisture retention, and helps control microbial growth. Reducing salt content without compromising these other attributes requires sophisticated food science. Looking at global patterns of salt consumption reveals interesting variations. Traditional diets in many parts of the world tend to be relatively high in salt, particularly in regions where fermented or preserved foods are dietary staples. Japanese cuisine, with its reliance on soy sauce, miso, and pickled foods, results in relatively high sodium intake. Mediterranean diets, often praised for their health benefits, can also be quite high in salt depending on how much cheese, cured meats, and olives are consumed. In contrast, traditional diets in some other regions, particularly those based primarily on fresh fruits, vegetables, and grains with minimal processing or preservation, tend to be much lower in sodium. These variations reflect different climates, different available foods, different preservation needs, and different cultural practices that developed over centuries. The future of salt production and use will likely be shaped by continuing concerns about environmental impact and health effects, by technological developments that enable new uses or more efficient production, and by the overall trajectory of industrial development, particularly in growing economies. As developing nations industrialize, their demand for salt, particularly for industrial purposes, will increase. This may put pressure on production capacity and on environmental systems. At the same time, growing awareness of environmental issues may drive innovations in how salt is used and recovered. Industrial processes that once discharged salt-laden waste streams might be redesigned to recover and reuse salt. Road maintenance practices might become more targeted and efficient, reducing the quantity of salt needed while maintaining safety. Salt has journeyed with humanity from the very beginning, from the first moments when our ancestors recognized its value and sought it out. It has been there through all the great transitions of human history, from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilizations, from isolated communities to globe-spanning empires, from handcraftsmanship to industrial production. The story of salt is in many ways the story of civilization itself, a thread that runs through our collective past and connects us to people who lived thousands of years ago in circumstances vastly different from our own. Yet they, like us, needed salt to live, valued it, traded for it, and organized aspects of their societies around obtaining and distributing it. What is remarkable about salt is how something so simple chemically can be so complex in its implications. Two elements, sodium and chlorine, combine in equal proportions to form a stable compound. This compound dissolves easily in water, has a characteristic taste, forms cubic crystals, and possesses properties that make it useful in countless ways. The simplicity of sodium chloride belies its importance. Life depends on it at the most fundamental level. The electrical impulses that allow our brains to think, our hearts to beat, our muscles to move, all require the movement of sodium ions across cell membranes. The chemistry is elegant and straightforward, yet the consequences are profound. The historical importance of salt reminds us that the things we take for granted, the items so common and cheap that we hardly notice them, were once rare and precious. It is difficult for someone living in the modern developed world to truly imagine what it would be like to consider salt valuable, to have to carefully portion it out, to regard access to salt as a genuine concern. Yet for most of human history, this was the reality. The transformation of salt from scarce commodity to abundant product happened relatively recently, within the last 2 centuries. This transformation was enabled by technological developments, by improved transportation, by the discovery and exploitation of vast underground deposits, and by the application of industrial methods to salt production. The result is that we live in an era of salt abundance unprecedented in human history. This abundance has its consequences, both positive and negative. On the positive side, no one in the developed world needs to worry about getting enough salt. The deficiency diseases that might have afflicted our ancestors are unknown to us. Food can be flavoured as we wish. Preservation is achieved through multiple methods not solely dependent on salt, and industrial processes that require salt as a raw material can operate without constraint. On the negative side, the very ease with which we can consume salt has led to overconsumption, with potential health implications. The environmental impacts of large-scale salt use, particularly for road de-icing, create challenges that require careful management and perhaps new technologies to address. Abundance brings its own problems, different from but no less real than the problems of scarcity. The technological innovations that made salt abundant were part of a broader pattern of industrialization and development that transformed nearly every aspect of material life. Steam power, mechanization, improved transportation networks, scientific understanding of chemistry and geology, all of these contributed to making salt cheap and plentiful. The same forces that changed salt production also changed the production of textiles, metals, energy, and countless other goods and services. Salt is one example, but an illustrative one, of how technological change reshapes the relationship between humans and natural resources. What was once laboriously extracted through human and animal effort can now be obtained with machines. What once required specialized local knowledge can now be done according to standardized procedures. What once could only be produced in certain locations can now be made almost anywhere. Yet for all the changes that industrialization brought, some things remain constant. People still need salt. The biological requirement has not changed. The ways we use salt for food, for flavor and preservation continue traditions that stretch back millennia, even if the specific techniques and recipes have evolved. Cultural associations with salt, the symbolic meanings and traditional practices, persist even when their original context has been lost. We still say someone is worth their salt, still observe customs involving salt at meals or in ceremonies, still recognize salt as something important, even if we struggle to articulate exactly why it matters to us. The global nature of modern commerce means that salt now moves around the world in ways that would have astonished earlier generations. A chemical plant in one country might use salt mined in another, transported across oceans on container ships to produce chemicals that are then shipped elsewhere for further processing or final use. The global supply chain for salt is part of the larger global economy, with all its efficiencies and vulnerabilities. This interconnection means that disruptions in one part of the world can affect salt availability elsewhere, though the multiple sources of salt and the generally abundant supply make serious shortages unlikely under normal circumstances. Looking forward, it seems probable that salt will remain important for the foreseeable future. The industrial uses that currently dominate salt consumption are tied to basic human needs and to manufacturing processes that have no obvious substitutes. We will continue to need chlorine for water treatment, sodium hydroxide for various industries, and salt for the numerous other applications that have developed over time. The scale of consumption may shift as economies develop and as technologies change, but the underlying demand will persist. Environmental concerns may drive changes in how salt is used, particularly for road maintenance, and health considerations may continue to influence dietary recommendations and food formulation, but salt itself is not going away. The deep history of salt, the geological processes that created the deposits we now mine, reminds us of the vastness of time and the dynamic nature of Earth's surface. The salt we use today was formed from ancient seas, deposited over millions of years, buried and transformed by geological forces. When we shake salt onto our food, we are using matter that has existed for longer than our species, longer than most species, that has been part of Earth through countless changes and transformations. This perspective can be humbling, a reminder that human history, for all its drama and significance to us, is a very recent chapter in a much longer story. Salt connects us to that longer story, to the planet's geological past, to the evolution of life in salty seas, to the countless generations of humans who valued salt and whose lives were shaped by its scarcity or abundance. It connects us to each other as well, across cultures and across time. Every human society has dealt with salt in some way, has recognized its necessity, has incorporated it into daily life and cultural practice. In this universal need and universal recognition, we find something fundamentally human, a shared experience that transcends the differences that often divide us. Salt, in its simplicity and its ubiquity, is part of what makes us human, part of the common inheritance we all share